My name is Tammy and I am with Better Spaces. We partner with buildings and companies to create programs that help you connect, create, and perform at your highest potential. Today we have Mim Senft from Global Women for Women, CEO and founder, and also Jennifer Ingram, founder and CEO of Calibrated Lens. So today our session is a better way forward, racial equity, DE&I, and creating community. And then next week we have part 2 where she'll share how companies and businesses can take a more intersectional approach to inclusion. So these timely and honest conversations will help empower, inspire you to move forward with intention and kindness. So a little bit about Jennifer. She's the founder and CEO of Calibrated Lens, and will share action steps anyone can take to help make the world a better place for everyone. So I'm going to pass it off to Mim. And before we start, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat and we will get to them.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tammy. As always, it's such a pleasure to be doing this partnership between Global Women for Wellbeing and Better Spaces. And delighted to have Jen Ingram join us, who is also a GW4W board member and somebody who has been working in the diversity and inclusion and addressing racism space for many, many years, and just an amazing voice on this topic. So thank you, Jen, for joining us today. And we're going to jump right in with what is racial equity and how is it different from diversity and inclusion? Sometimes we get these things mixed up.
Absolutely. And thank you so much, Mim and Better Spaces, for having me. I would like to just add a little bit more about myself, considering the conversation and the space and the tone that we're in. Just a few days ago, we celebrated and recognized what is Mental Health Awareness Month. Beyond it being Mental Health Awareness Month, we also acknowledge the 1-year date since George Floyd was murdered. And in being mindful of both of those things, I think it's important to highlight and share through a sense of, in a lens of vulnerability, a little bit more about our individual identities. And so this is also a part of the talk, but it's modeling behaviors that tend to reduce some of the barriers that exist between individuals by peeling back the curtains a little bit and inviting folks into your life. And so I'm based in Cincinnati, Ohio. I start by just saying that my journey didn't begin the day that I was born. It began with my ancestors, right? And realizing that I am a descendant of enslaved Africans. I am the descendant of 2 great-grandparents that fled the Jim Crow South and racial terrorism. And became refugees in the city of Detroit, which is where I'm originally from. I use the pronouns she, her, hers, which are signals of inclusion. Although my identity aligns with how I present, for others it may not. And so know that this is a safe space to disclose or to share your pronouns as a signal of greater inclusion. And so, Mim, thank you so much for asking, the question regarding the difference between diversity and inclusion, racial equity, so on and so forth. Language matters, and each of these words have very different meaning. Starting with diversity, that is a noun, it is a state, it is a difference, right? And when we say difference, we have socialized this term to be limited to sometimes only those elements or dimensions that we could see, realizing it's so much broader than just the things that we can see about individuals. Moving beyond that to understand lived experience, right? Things like I just introduced about myself, diversity of thought, orientation, as well as understanding military experience, cognitive diversity, neurodiversity, right? The list goes on and on and on. So diversity simply means difference. Moving to inclusion, inclusion is a verb. It is an action word, right? Inclusion is the intentional act of creating spaces where folks can feel welcome, respected, supported. and realizing that, again, these are two different words with two very different meanings. I make the joke, you know, we have this saying, right? I now pronounce you diversity and inclusion, right? And some couples have a baby named Equity, right? And so realizing the naming conventions and the words that have meaning, and how that comes up and plays into us having a degree of understanding of what these things mean when we're talking about them. And so as it relates to equity, I think that is probably a term that folks are less familiar with, right? And realizing that diversity and inclusion, that old equation, as we like to refer to it, was one that was birthed out of compliance and regulatory affairs, right? And moving into what we are now experiencing, which is more of a cultural, has more of a cultural lens, and understanding that when we expand that equation, right, equity, inclusion, access, creates a sense of belonging and diversity, no longer positioning diversity as the driver, but instead an outcome of having an environment or a space that is equitable. And so as it relates to equity and equality, right? Let's go through the nuances and just ensure that we're all starting from a solid starting point. Equality is equal, right? Everyone has the same thing. Equity is making those adjustments to ensure that there is a fair and just treatment and access to opportunity and advancement. And realizing that what it means to create equity is very different from a process of equality, which, as we continue to dive into this conversation a bit deeper, we'll get into some of those nuances of what it means to actually apply a lens of racial equity, right? And so when we look at intersectional equity, we might hear things like the work that we do at GW4W, right? Gender equity, right? Striving for a greater a sense of equality or in pursuit of equality, looking at ability, right? And understanding that intersectional equity is all encompassing. But when we apply a race-first lens or a lens of racial equity, it's prioritizing or putting a lens of race on top of all of those other elements that we know, again, make up various forms of diversity. And with that race-first lens, and applying a lens of racial equity, we know that if we were to look at or disaggregate data or understanding experience, those gaps or disparities are exacerbated when you apply a lens of race, right, across every facet and function. And so when we're looking through a lens of racial equity, we're looking at data, right? We're analyzing and understanding information about race and ethnicity, and understanding disparities and the reasons for disparities, right? And disparities are nothing more than gaps, right? But understanding why those gaps exist and understanding the root causes of those issues. And so we oftentimes talk about race and racism. I want to first start by saying race is a construct. It is not real, right? It is a social construct. And so as we are looking at the ways that we have segmented different groups, different communities through this lens of race, and how we have racialized the lived experience and our systems, it helps to start to peel back the layers and understand, again, those differences between strictly just diversity, difference, inclusion, the intentional active act, racial equity. And I'll also just throw belonging in there because that is the element that is most essential, I believe, and what it means to create a space where folks are able to achieve a sense of equity. And so looking at racial equity, it is an outcome, it is a process. And within that process, it's ensuring that we are no longer defined or seeing racialized outcomes.
Yeah, it's really important. There's a lot of stuff packed in there. And I think what's really stands out for me is this idea of intersectionality. Right. And I love that you were talking about this layered approach. So I think that for many of us, it's easier for people to put things into boxes, or I'm just going to look in this lens, or I'm just going to look in this lens, or I want to try and understand it here. But in reality, if we're really going to address some of this, we have to see these intersecting points if we're really going to get to the root of racism. And as you clearly point out, these are things, and I think we should all, like, each of us comes from our own experience. So, you know, to think that we don't have some of this in our DNA is probably a little disingenuous. We're going to be upfront about it. So it's great that you define it in a way that hopefully makes us a little bit more curious about this. So I think, you know, everybody wants action steps, right? So are there, for all of us, if you were going to say, I want to address anti-racism in myself or in my community, what are one or two steps that each of us can do right now? What are the questions we should be asking ourselves, or the things we should be doing?
Yeah, Mem, I'm so glad you asked that question. I think that for many years we ruminated in the space of awareness building, right? And so we can build all the awareness in the world, but what are we doing? And so to your question regarding anti-racism, I want to first start with a quote from Dr. Ingram. He is the author of the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And so this quote is, to be anti-racist is to think nothing is behaviorally wrong or right, inferior or superior with any of the racial groups. Whenever the anti-racist sees individuals behaving positively or negatively, the anti-racist sees exactly that. Individuals behaving positively or negatively, not representatives of whole races. To be anti-racist is to de-racialize behavior, to remove the tattooed stereotype from every racialized body. And behavior is something that humans do, not races, right? And so understanding what it means to be anti-racist first starts with understanding racism. For many years, and I think this is a part of the reason why we're still kind of stuck in this rut, in this uncomfortable space of not wanting to talk about race. We have solely viewed racism as an interpersonal element or an interpersonal issue. But I want to first start by unpacking the need to understand racism in all of its forms. Most importantly, in my opinion, is the ways in which the structures and systems that we exist within have been racialized, in the way in which racism, institutional racism, structural racism manifests and impacts the experiences of each of us. It's not just something that impacts people of color or people from marginalized communities. It impacts all of us in different ways. And so first understanding racism and then diving into your own race, right? I think that we have normalized whiteness as a dominant versus understanding that that too is a race. And so within exploring whiteness and understanding the ways in which as a dominant group in America that has shifted and shaped and molded what we oftentimes determine as the norm. Right. And so when we think about dominant culture and the ways in which dominant culture is set as the frame or the default for everything, right? For the ways in which we are expected to show up, the ways in which we are expected to speak, the ways in which we dress, the ways in which we are, expected to engage, and, you speak proper English or you don't, right? And understanding the ways in which we continue to hang our hat on normalized dominant culture, it continues to erode the foundation of the ability to create a sense of belonging and understanding of what it means to have access. And when we think about access and opportunity, I think that unpacking the layers and what you can do, three things, right? I said already, unpacking and understanding racism in all of its forms, exploring your own individual identity and your racial identity, regardless of what race you are. That third element is understanding and unpacking these normalized notions that we use as defaults. And the last point that I'll make regarding action steps or things that we can do is realizing that this is not a course. This is not a training. This is a lifestyle. Right. And not just a fashionable lifestyle. Right. It is one that requires continued examination of vulnerability and understanding that, we don't know everything. And if we don't know everything, there's a sense of humility that comes along with that. And realizing that every individual is just that, an individual. And so unpacking stereotypes and generalizations about individual groups and realizing that it's extremely short-sighted. So those are 4 tips and recommendations on active things that folks can do.
Yeah, I love that. As a practical application of that, it's something that I started to do years ago, is looking at commercials. We forget the visual cueing that we get every single day. Even websites, I look at websites, whether it's for businesses, community organizations, and it's fascinating how few look at them through that lens. Like, what are we really saying? Oh, we're all inclusive. Well, literally every picture on this website is from somebody who's 30 or younger. Like, clearly you don't care about people, or it doesn't look like you do, or they're all one type of person. And it is interesting to see some, not a lot, but some progress. When you look at commercials, we're seeing more diverse faces and ages, and some, not quite there yet, but it's an interesting exercise. If there's a show that you like, to just note during that time, who was in those commercials? What are those visual cues that you're seeing all the time? Because we process those pictures at 60,000 times faster than anything we hear. Mm-hmm. So it's just a great check. And I would even say, if you own or run a website or have something for an organization, really take a look at it through that lens. It's a great exercise. And get other people in your organization or in your community to look at that and just get some feedback, some real feedback.
Absolutely. And Mim, just to expand on that thought a bit more, I think that we oftentimes do look at the imagery, and that's just a first step, right? Yes. Realizing that you can very well sub out people of color or people of varied ability into an image, but that still is not getting to that space of belonging. Representation in isolation is not inclusion. It is not creating a sense of belonging. It's digging into the nuances of identity and ensuring that those cultural elements are also present. There was a recent movie, and they were saying that, it was a remake. And the original actor, was white, and they casted an African-American male in this role the next time around. And so literally there was this dissection of this film and all of the ways that they didn't just sub this new person in to read the same lines, but they added in cultural relevance to the identity of this character to give it depth. Right. And so increasingly so with organizations that are engaging in this work or attempting to center this as it relates to how their brand or their presence appears through a more multicultural lens, what I would say is, whereas you might be able to just have representation historically, people are now digging into and lifting up the layers to better understand how are you not just having representation, but what does it mean for you to create a sense of inclusion and pair with that? And so it is a space where many folks are acknowledging that the progress in having greater representation, but taking that next step to also layer in a sense of inclusion, even in imagery and the ways in which you portray folks. And I'll just call out one organization that has done a tremendously just beautiful job of that. It's Proctor and Gamble. They have a new video. They did the talk a couple of years ago, if you haven't seen that one, but it's turned into a series. They now have the look, and then beyond the look, there's a new video called The Pause. And I mean, all of them are just, it's outstanding. And so as you look at and look for models, that's just one example of really great storytelling from a genuine and authentic space.
Yeah, it's great. It's always great to have real places that you can go and look and get some ideas. Well, as you know, Better Spaces and Global Women for Wellbeing are all about healthy leadership. So and at all levels, not just at the top. So love to just talk a little bit about this connection between health, physical and mental health, which you touched on a little bit, and this integration of equity and inclusion, making this connection for our viewers.
Absolutely. And Mim, I think that in order to first start, we have to realize that health is not a universal term.
Right.
And well-being is deeply personalized and individualized. And
Mhm.
so what might be healthy for you, what might be well-being or wellness for me, there are some similarities and commonalities, but there are also differences. And I want to start by understanding and unpacking the ways in which internalized racism can manifest and impact wellness and well-being, right? Going back to the dominant culture and the norms that we've established. And so one element that we oftentimes don't take into account is trauma, right? And
Right.
understanding the ways in which trauma manifests, right? And so what is the trauma response? Fight, flight, freeze. And so as we look at individuals in different scenarios, in different situations, I think it's important that we start to apply that lens of trauma as we seek to understand and make sense of behaviors and actions. When we think about what it means to create a sense of well-being, realize that some interventions or some things could be re-traumatizing, right?
Right.
And even the notion of what it means to be a provider, right, and a health provider, right? We know that babies, African American babies, are 3 times more likely than white babies to die before the age of 1 under the care of a white physician versus that of an African American physician. And as we start to unpack many of these notions around the stigma that exists, the bias that exists inherently in spaces related to health and healthcare, I think that taking the time to understand the history is really important. And that too is a racialized history. As we think about things like the Tuskegee syphilis incidents, if we think about the smallpox blankets, as we think about the father of gynecology who operated on African American women that were enslaved in many instances without anesthesia, as we look at Henrietta Lacks, right? Understanding all of these things that make up experience. And those experiences are passed down from generation to generation. And so as we look at what it means to create a space of health and well-being through the lens of equity and inclusion, it's understanding the past. It's understanding that the past is not in a neatly wrapped box on a shelf that we can then move on from. These things are ever present. And so it comes with a certain degree of acknowledgement as well as an understanding of and a need for humility, specifically cultural humility, realizing that we don't know everything about every group. And while some of these things, may impact different individuals differently, we can't, as a default, say, well, this group of people or this patient that I saw didn't have a problem with this, so why do you? Or beyond a direct interaction with a provider, from a sense of well-being, well, this person thought that the yoga offering in our benefit plan was just fine. That was exactly what they needed to be able to experience a sense of well-being and work-life balance and have a space to de-stress or decompress, right? Just as though if any of us were to go to a restaurant, we have a menu for a reason with tons of options because we all have different things that resonate and beyond resonating, different things that meet the need of us as individuals. And so what I would continue to reinforce as it relates to understanding what it takes to create a community of well-being is an individualized approach and having conversation, moving from transactional engagements and assumptions to having conversation and being in relationship with, and beyond being in relationship with, understanding the need to understand and ask those questions and coming from a place of curiosity to better understand what different individuals need to experience a sense of well-being and wellness.
I could not agree more with you about that particular piece. And I think, again, it clearly shows where often when we talk about this, we're not making that connection. If someone is traumatized, like we think about that, if they had been through a house fire, if they'd been through anything, and again, I'm not trying to minimize, but I'm saying is that in our businesses or when we deal with people, we're much clearer about those things. Somebody dies in a car accident, terribly tragic, it's a trauma. if we're really going to start to tackle our understanding of what we need to meaningfully make measurable, as you know, I always say this, measurable change around racial equity, it is starting to understand some of these nuances, and that, you know, in our businesses and how we provide health and well-being resources, I love that you emphasize we have to do more curious questioning and a lot more listening. And the more we can do that and understand how it feels for different people coming from different backgrounds actually helps us then move forward. But too often we want a simple answer. We want it done in a lunch and learn. We want it done yesterday because we have our bottom line that we have to take care of, or a day-to-day work, or I just have to put food on the table for my family. But it is a time for opportunity. And I really look forward to having our second conversation where we're going to dig into a little bit more about more the nuts and bolts when we talk about this through the workplace lens, and just digging deep around that, because it's such a topic in so many organizations. And there's a lot of misinformation and a lot of what unfortunately has happened around things like sustainability. I don't know if there's a term now that we're using for, is it DE&I washing? Like greenwashing, like they do for that, or?
Yeah, I think
we can do better.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. And I know that there was a comment I made regarding the daily trauma and fatigue from microaggressions and micro assaults. That is absolutely correct. And living in a space of being on guard, stereotype threat, identity threat, and what it means, and the physical impacts, right, of being in that space. And so I'm looking forward to continuing to dig in deeper into opportunities for the workplace and how these things manifest in the workplace, and things that you can do proactively and even reactively when incidents do occur in our next conversation. So thanks so much for having me. I'm looking forward to our next discussion.